Hey guys, I just played Alan Wake, the original for 360. Because the new one's coming out soon, Remedy's kind of been a studio that's kind of been put on my radar because I played Control, which was also a really great game. And I realized, oh hey, these are the Alan Wake people. And Alan Wake was one of those games, and looking at it, it came out in 2010, so it's over a decade old. But it's actually pretty decent. The funny thing is, though, that I always say that the 90s to the 2010s is the golden age of gaming. And this kind of came at the end of the golden age. So I think other things were coming out. Nier came out that year, Dark Souls came out that year. So on a comparative level, Alan Wake at the time of its release was pretty mid. It was like a detective horror story, whatever. It's literally like Silent Hill for the West, or Silent Hill at home. Don't worry, we have Silent Hill at home. But so at the time it came out, I didn't really pay attention to it. I think I played the demo. I was like, okay, you're aiming light at bad guys and shooting them and like whatever. And I really enjoyed Control, and I came back to this and I booted it up and I was like, wow, this is actually really good. I got it at like some bargain bin sale because I was going through some old games, being like, oh yeah, these are the games that I could have maybe tried but didn't have time or interest. But what's striking about Alan Wake is that it looks really good, like really good for a last, or how many generations? I think we're 2 generations ago, console. It looks like a really good game. And it controls really, really fluidly, very surprisingly. But of course, the main drive of that game, I think, really is the story, but everything else is also very solid. So what is the deal with Alan Wake? So I believe it's based off a real book series. And let me just look that up so I can confirm with you guys. Because I believe they credit Sam Lake. It's a book by Rick Burroughs, not Sam Lake. Sam Lake is the name of the guy who apparently was the author, or not, apparently. Okay, so Alan Wake is actually a novel, but it gets a little screwy because what the game is about, it's about a writer or a novelist who gets stuck in his own story, basically. And it's interesting because that kind of story sounds kind of whimsical, whatever, but it's actually a more of a horror-themed action game. And I said it's a lot like Silent Hill because, like, I was telling my friend about this, and they literally got it confused with Silent Hill Shattered Memories on the Wii, because they're very similar games. You have a flashlight as your main source of like power. You have to reach a lighthouse. The characters look almost the same. They're very similar, a lot of very funny ways. But whereas Silent Hill is very, very interesting and nuanced, this game also is that, but it just lacks the actual horror elements. It's focusing more on the action side, and the action is surprisingly good. It's very simple as well, which is basically you have enemies who are made of this darkness material, and everything revolves around light and darkness. And so you use your flashlight to shine your light on the enemy, and basically that'll dissipate their shield, and then you can harm them using your firearms. So if you just fire away, nothing will happen. So you have to use the light first to take off their protection, and then you can finish them off with anything you want. There are a lot of really interesting, an array of weapons. There's the normal, looks like a 358 Magnum revolver. That's your main weapon. You can also find shotguns, pump action shotguns, hunting rifles. And then the funny things are like flare guns, flashbangs, and flares, which do a lot more damage to the enemies because they're made of darkness. Using a flare will actually just kill them. So it's almost like a grenade launcher is a flare, and a flashbang is basically a grenade. And what a normal flare will do is that it's one of these where you hold up around you, and it'll dissipate the enemies, so you can basically recuperate if you're surrounded. The one thing I'm just iffy about on the gameplay side is that they just give you a lot of supplies. Like you will never, it'd be very difficult to run out of ammo. And I'm not always a fan of that kind of game design. I always feel like you need to be forced to switch weapons or do item management, be like, oh no, I have to use this in this scenario, and then this part they gave me a lot of flashbangs, so that's what I'm supposed to use, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of like you have enough ammo to use basically whatever weapon you want. So it's like, all right, whatever. And it just depends on how well you play. What I did find is that the way the engagements happen is that you'll be in an area, and sometimes it'll have this huge darkness and this hissing sound come up, which will let you know, hey, there's going to be an enemy encounter here. And usually it's a very large encounter. Sometimes there'll be no queue for that, and in that case it's usually just one or two enemies. There's also other things you can do in the environment. You have giant light bulbs or searchlights that you can use to help weaken the enemies up. There's exploding canisters, electrical wires, and other kinds of things in the environment you can use to actually assist you. But a lot of it takes place in dense forested areas. And so there are quite a few times where you can even have the cue that there's an engagement about to happen, and the enemy can still kind of sneak up on you. So you do need to like pay attention, and it is kind of scary, especially in the early game, obviously. What's funny though is that usually what will happen is that when the engagement starts, it'll do a slow-mo thing and it'll show you actually where the enemy is. So they could be right behind you when that engagement starts, or they could be far away if you spot them with your flashlight first. And it's really interesting how it's a very simple mechanic, but the enemies are very fluid, and you do have a dodge mechanic, which is also your run button. So if you tap LB right as they're about to attack, you'll do a dodge and that'll go to slow-mo, and you can do a counterattack basically. And that's pretty much the whole gameplay. There's like really only two different enemy types. They're like the weak guys that take out their shield, they take a couple of hits, they're down, and then there are the bigger guys who take 5 or 6 shots. There are also these clouds of crows that'll swarm you, and it's best to use the flare or sort of a wide area effect against those guys. You can't really shoot them, you just use the light and the whole thing will dissipate eventually. But those are pretty much the 3 enemy types in the whole game. But they just have so much detail and fluidity and kind of unpredictableness programmed into them that it makes them very enjoyable to fight again and again and again. So they really nailed it with that sort of 30-second rule of this engagement. And yeah, there's so many slight nuances where you go into a battle and you think, oh, I could have done that better, or I should have done this rather than that. But yeah, it just makes me laugh that this game also has a pistol, a shotgun, and a hunting rifle, just like the first Silent Hill game, and you're using a flashlight. It's like Silent Hill if it's Western and on steroids and guns blazing. And that's how I think of it. It's so funny. It's like, what if Silent Hill actually was a game? But speaking of Silent Hill, the main appeal really, I think, is the story. So how is the story in Alan Wake? After beating it, I'm kind of mixed on the whole experience. I liked it, but I felt it could have been better. It's really funny because, well, first of all, this game is very well written and it can be quite funny at times. And it's funny because they bring up one point that something like Stephen King doesn't know how to end novels. You never actually want to reveal what the horror, what the existential dread actually is. You just want to keep it a mystery. And it's funny because at the end of the game, they don't, they take that advice to the T, where they don't reveal any of it. You're just kind of left hanging like, I guess it's resolved. And I also did play the 2 DLC chapters, and the ending is still, oh, okay, that's taken care of, that one thing, but everything else is still unresolved, kind of. So I would say it's above average, but I would have wanted more from it. But I'm still very impressed for a 2010 game to just function like this. It really feels something that it feels like one of those games you don't need to play, but if you did play it, you'd be like, oh yeah, that experience. It's very specific. It's very, very specific. Anyway, what is the story? So you have the author, Alan Wake. He was a successful author guy, and he wrote his last book in which he killed off the main character. And he's like, okay, I'm done with this book series. I want to do something else because it was depressing him. And after his big success and his fame and his interviews and whatever, he decides to take a vacation to get away from it all. And then there's this thing where it's been like, this vacation he's taking, it's like been 2 years. And like, it's kind of odd how the time is, right? Because you're really starting to mess around with other people's perceptions and his perception of what's real and what's not. So it's one of those psychological thriller kind of things. But it's kind of like he goes with his wife on this vacation to this remote American town in the Pacific Northwest. And, you know, he kind of wants to keep it all hush that he's not here, and the word gets out and people are looking for him and whatever. And, you know, he has all these foreshadowing and premonitions of something bad's going to happen. And so he gets to the cabin with his wife, and the way he gets there is that he's given a key by this old woman, while the key that they're supposed to get from this other guy, he misses them, and he says, you know, they never showed up. So you get this mysterious key from this mysterious woman, and they go to the cabin, and the main running theme is that his wife is afraid of the dark. So you always have to, you know, be there before sundown and have all the lights working. And then, of course, you know what happens, the power goes out, you go out to fix it, and suddenly she seems to fall off or the balcony or the cabin and into the lake, and Allan jumps in after her. And then that's the first point where that reality ends, and suddenly Allan wakes up in a crashed car on the side of the road. And it's kind of like, all right, very, very Silent Hill. Like, it's almost the exact same beats. So Allan then has to find his wife, and he just realizes, oh, hey, there's these weird creatures. They're after me. I have to use my flashlight to defeat them, whatever. They hate the light, and each checkpoint is a street light, or a street lamp, rather. And so as you go through the game, you try to figure out what's going on, because people think, you know, okay, what happened? Because you know, the police find you and the sun comes up and you can't tell them that, you know, you were fighting these shadow creatures, so they think you're crazy. And you think this is all in his head, but then his agent Barry shows up, who's like the comic relief. And then Barry sees them too. So it's like, okay, so Allan's not crazy. And then there's this whole thing of a running arc where you find these manuscript pages, and they're all the pages for the next book he was going to write. And there's this other Allan who's back in the cabin, and he is trying to write a story, and he's writing as if from the future tense. And he's saying basically that he has to write this story in order to save his wife. And so as you find these manuscript pages, it's a really cool mechanic that you think wouldn't work, but I really enjoyed it, where you'll get maybe like a paragraph of content where it tells you what is going to happen next in the next scene. And they're little collectibles that you collect, along with coffee thermoses for some reason. Coffee thermoses are just the collectibles in this game, and there's no reason for it. It just is. It reminds me of JJ the Missing, when the collectibles are just donuts. And she doesn't even like, she mentions nothing about donuts. For him, he mentions nothing about coffee. He's just a writer. You just like, okay, whatever. They're coffee, whatever. Coffee thermoses. But anyway, so you kind of question what reality is. Like, what are you seeing? Is this real? Because basically you're writing the story, or this other Allan is writing the story as it's happening. And so you kind of like, you have to act out what you've already written and what comes true. So it's really cool to read something like, oh, Barry did this, and then Allan, whatever. And then you read that, and they're all spoken in audio logs, but then you actually see it happen. It's a really cool mechanic because you're already judging. It's like, you go see the movie based off your favorite book and it's nothing like what you expected it to be. So you read the words and you have a vision in your head of what's going to happen. And then the game in a few minutes does exactly that. And it either meets your expectations or doesn't. I mean, it'll do what it says, but the way it does it is interesting to see. And it actually keeps you interested in continuing the story. So this is all great. It's all very cool. There's even like a side part where it turns out that there's a side plot that's kind of hinted and dropped through, that there's this psychologist in this very town, and he's basically saying that Allan's wife brought him here so that he could start writing again, and that basically when she brought him here, she actually drowned. And so Allan has been creating this story where he's the hero in his imagination in order to cope with her lossing. Again, very Silent Hill, but again, is that actually what's going on? Because it's even not clear on that. What is the actual reality? And the very kind of sad, angry, disappointing truth is that they don't tell you. As I said before, there's not a very finite conclusion to the story other than I won't spoil it too much, but basically there's another entity that wants Allan to write the story to make it more powerful, just like a Lovecraftian god. And so Allan is doing this, but also aware that he has to leave a loophole in the story's logic so that he can succeed. And so basically at the end, he's able to essentially save his wife, but he dooms himself to remain in the darkness. So that happens, and it's like, cool, I guess. Like there's no real resolution. It just kind of like he's in the darkness, but it's not like a final thing, because it's not very clearly communicated. And so in the other two DLCs, he's still just in the darkness, but now he's going to be able to, now he basically has a typewriter, he's going to write his way out of the darkness now, and it's like to be continued. And I'm like, all right. So that's where the series was 10 years ago. So you're basically up to speed now on that. I've left out a lot of other details, but the cast of characters is very entertaining, very fun, very interesting. One thing I do need to bring up though, if you're still interested, if you want to play Alan Wake today, I would highly recommend you play it on the Xbox 360 and not the Xbox One with the upscaled 60 FPS and whatever kind of upgrades they did, for two main reasons. One, on that actual point. So I started the game on my 360 just because I had it out. And then I switched over to my Xbox One, and it said, download the upgrade, blah, 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 and I launched it. And so the first thing you notice, it's 60 FPS, it's way smoother, it looks really fluid. But I don't think it's necessarily better. And it's a really weird thing. When you're in the forest and it's dark and you're wondering where the enemies are, it's actually a lot scarier at 30 FPS because you're just not able to see as much. It's a weird, maybe unintentional design choice where, at 60 FPS, I was really not ever really scared or intimidated by the horde, because I could tell, like from the slight movement in the corner, that, oh, that's where he was. I know 60 FPS is for like multiplayer shooters and stuff like that. For a game like this, it doesn't actually benefit it. So this is the crazy revelation I've had, that something I've taken from this game is that having a lower frame rate is almost necessary for horror games. It actually makes it scarier because you don't have your full capabilities, and you're constantly guessing what's in the corner of the screen, and you just can't see as much. It's a really weird experience I don't think I would have between just two very different versions of the game, or very slight versions. Like they just change one setting and suddenly it's completely different. Likewise, and again, I don't know what this was or what happened, but like it brought over my exact save data, including my options. And so even my brightness setting, even though my brightness setting was exactly the same on both systems, on the same screen, the brightness setting in the Xbox 360 original had more atmosphere. It had more soul. I don't know how to like describe this, but it just seemed darker. The blacks seemed just richer and more just deeper. And the new one just looked like it was flat, and I don't know, it didn't seem to have as much bloom as the original. And the brightness setting was the exact same point and whatever. So along with the FPS boost, it obviously did something else to the graphical thing to make it more adaptable to LCD screens, maybe. But I didn't like it. It actually took away the atmosphere. And I just thought if they ever remake this game, it's going to fail, because the one thing remakes cannot do is do lighting and atmosphere. They always change the lighting, and it always kills the game every single time. It's crazy. And even with that slight change, the game just felt very different. It had a different tone to it. It felt like the colors were kind of washed out and flat. Like if you had a side-by-side comparison, I'd rather take the slower, moodier experience than the fluid, like banal experience. I don't know how else to say it. So I know all this spec guys want to kill themselves right now, or kill me rather, but that's how it is. So that's kind of maybe a subjective issue. Maybe that's just me. Maybe you look at the FPS boost version and you're like, that's not so bad. Maybe it's like, it looks fine. It's barely a difference. I'd be fine with that version. Fair. But there is another reason that is actually, unfortunately, actually almost necessary to play on the original 360 and not the Xbox One version. And I tested this, and it's really kind of bizarre but understandable. It's also interesting though. It's the way it's structured is that it's in episodes. So I think there's 7 or so episodes, and they're each about an hour or so long. And you get to the end of the level, you fight the boss, whatever, and then it kind of does like an outro and like a mini credits, and then it plays a song. And pretty much all the songs are licensed songs. And there's even, so for some reason, all the songs on the new version, I guess because it's technically a different version of the game, they didn't renew the creative's license to these songs. So when you get to this mini credits, nothing plays. It's just silence. And I literally tried this. I went up between my 360 and my Xbox One. If you go into like the settings menu, I do playback and play songs, it's just silence for all the songs. The soul of the game is literally gone in the Xbox One version, or the Xbox One upgrade, or whatever. While in the original version, they all play fine. And that's actually and it's actually a huge issue, because in the opening scene, there's like an inside joke where these two drunk rock stars or roadies at the cafe, and the guy like says, "Oh, can you put on 'She put the lamb in the coconut and took it all up," as he drunkenly sings along to it in the bar. And if you are playing the new version, that doesn't play, because they actually have the license. So it's like you kind of have to play the 360 version to actually get the definitive experience, no matter what the labeling is. It's really unfortunate. But to that point, like you look at some of the songs in the credits list, and just keep in mind there is a different song for each like 1 hour or so segment of gameplay, and some of these are like Depeche Mode, David Bowie. Like, these are not just whoever songs. Some of these are like big names. You're like, oh my God, like, how did they afford at the time to put so many big names in the game and just blow that money? It's just crazy. But yeah, that's the unfortunate truth. And to that point, there are some really good, nice choices in these credit sequences. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. I've covered gameplay, story, presentation. But yeah, all in all, it's actually a very solid game. It's nothing that I would be like, oh, you need to play it, but it's just very distinct that it's the guy with the flashlight game. And it controls really well. And my other revelation while playing this is that made me realize, 2010 is kind of the end of the golden era. And kind of all of the genres that we had at that point did not evolve past that. So Dark Souls just became Dark Souls, Dark Souls, Dark Souls, Dark Souls. The guy with the flashlight, that's like a slight action game. It's like there were no new types of games. Like in the early 2000s, like a game like Mass Effect, people didn't think that something like that was possible. Or something like Dark Souls, like real innovation. And it kind of made me sad a little bit, because as nice as Alan Wake is, it's also just it's so good, but only by today's standards, where everything feels the same now. So that was my only other takeaway. But yeah, otherwise, I think it's worth a shot. If you're planning on playing the sequel, I think pick this one up. I literally bought this at like a bargain bin kind of thing. I just saw it and like, oh yeah, well, the sequel's coming out, I guess I'll get this. Because I remember like whatever, and it turned out to be, I played the whole thing and it was great. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it gets my recommendation, and yeah, that's it. Take care.